Welcome to the Archippus Podcast.
As members of Archippus, we want to encourage followers of Jesus to pursue the work God has called them to do.
Jesus calls us to follow him, and in our call to follow, we receive a call to work.
And we want every follower of Christ to recognize that they have already received a call to do good work for the kingdom of God.
Hello, Mason.
Hey, Alex.
How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing okay. I'm tired. I did not sleep great, but it's fine. This is
Why
why the
didn't you
good
sleep
Lord.
great?
Why didn't I sleep great? I don't know. It's one of those nights where, like, if you go to bed really, really, really tired, but then you don't sleep consistently through all 8 hours, like you wake up and then go back to sleep and wake up and go back to sleep, it just messes with you. But
I get that.
This is why the good Lord has given us caffeine. Maybe. I don't know. I don't think caffeine actually impacts me all that much, but I drink it anyway because I really like coffee. Anyway, welcome everybody to the Archippus Podcast. We hopefully have a really good discussion for you today. We're excited to continue developing the theology of work, how the Bible portrays human beings as creatures who are given a mission, given a purpose, how you and I, our lives are not meaningless, but God is calling us to do work, both in a general sense, but also in a very specific and unique sense for each and every single person who follows after him. And we're excited to continue that today in our discussion on Judges. So Mason, I guess just to kind of kickstart this conversation, how does work first appear in Judges, or this idea of mission, or the idea of a purpose? Where does this first come up in Judges?
I think it really comes up when you look at the ending of Joshua. So Joshua, they've kind of come into the land, they've kind of settled, they've made a little bit of some ground into the land, and then Judges is all about, okay, what are they going to do next? And it's got this big push of, okay, are they going to continue to go out and claim the land that God has promised to them? And we look in the beginning and they just utterly fail. It's just like one account after next of listing each tribe as failing to eliminate the enemies in their territory. And I think that's something unique. Like, it wasn't just God saying, all of Israel failed. No, he had to list out one by one saying, and you failed, and you failed, and you failed. And it just causes all of these problems for the people going forward. And that's all the first chapter of Judges is all about, of you people had a mission and you knew what God had called you to do. It was the mission he gave you at Mount Sinai. You've been wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years. You are the generation that God has chosen to enter into the promised land, to take ownership of his promises, and they just could not step away from the same problems that their parents had, and they start a cycle of just death and decay and just chaos. And it's a really disappointing story when you read the book of Judges, and you're just like, really, God, you want these people to redeem humanity? It's messed up.
It's a real bummer. Story, that's for sure.
It is. Honestly, as a kid, I remember reading some of the stories, in Sunday school, and they're all depicted as if these people are like superheroes. But I got older and I read them, and I'm like, no, some of them are actually terrible people. And then the last few chapters of Judges, and we'll get that into a minute, is just absolutely heartbreaking to read. And you're just like, where's my hope in humanity now kind of feeling by the time you get to the end of Judges. But it's all to really tell a very powerful point for future generations to not really make these mistakes, right?
Yeah, well, and so I want to take a step back real quick and kind of reiterate, because I know you said it earlier, but I want to reiterate the mission that God had given the people of Israel. When God redeems Israel and he rescues them from slavery in Egypt, he brings them out through the wilderness and up to this land that, is known as the Promised Land. And the Promised Land is already inhabited by people. But God tells the Israelites, I'm going to use you to drive out these people. These people are evil and wicked. And I'm using you essentially as a tool, for judgment and justice here. But you are going to claim this land. And Judges opens up, with this kind of failure report. But the truth is that Judges isn't even the first time where Israel had failed to take the land. If you, go all the way back to Numbers, God originally was going to have Israel go into the Promised Land in Numbers. And you get this cool story. Well, not cool. I don't know why I said cool. But you get this story of Israel sending spies into the Promised Land to scope it out. And the spies come back. And 10 of the 12 spies say, there's no way. There's no way we can do this. We can't do the mission God's giving us. 2 of the spies are like, God's on our side. Anything's possible. Let's go. But Israel listens to the 10 spies. And so they don't actually take on the mission that God was calling them to do. So not only did they fail in Numbers, and that entire generation of Israelites did not take the Promised Land, but then when a new generation comes and they actually go into the land, even that new generation fails. And so we're just kind of starting off this entire narrative just with, we're steeped in generational failure to actually do the job that God has called the Israelites to do.
Yeah, they're, like you said in Judges chapter 1, it's just this massive failure. And then you get to Judges 2, and God kind of gives the reasoning behind all this failure, and that it's the context for everything going forward, where he tells them in Judges chapter 2, verse 11, he says, and the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh and served the Baals. And they abandoned Yahweh, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them and bowed down to them, and they provoked Yahweh to anger. They abandoned Yahweh and served the Baals and the Asheroth. And it's that's the big theme of everything that happens, right? So then God, because these people are constantly in this terrible situation, where they're not doing what God is doing, they end up getting oppressed by different people, the very people they were supposed to drive out, but now they find themselves partnering with them rather than partnering with God. And it causes them to eventually be oppressed. And then every time this happens, God raises up a judge. So can you speak a little bit to what a judge is? Because I know in our context, we naturally think a judge is in a law court setting. And we think someone with black robes, maybe a wig with white curls and a gavel and just shouting at people, and saying, you're guilty and you're going to jail. And I think that's how we oftentimes think. Well, the judges must be the exact same thing, but they're actually different, right? Wouldn't you agree? And can you explain a little bit about what the judge was and their job?
Yeah. So in the book of Judges, when we say the word judge, we're not talking about a judge who's in court, settling issues, determining if someone's guilty or not. In the book of Judges, there are certain individuals who God raises up as judges, and these people are often military leaders. They're often people who are leading the Israelites to fight against the other people groups in the Promised Land, the very people groups that the Israelites failed to drive out in the beginning. And so Judges is kind of the same story said 20 different times over and over and over again, where the Israelites are disobedient with God. They reject God and what he's called them to do. As a result, the people groups in the Promised Land will oppress the Israelites. The Israelites will get upset. They'll cry out to God for mercy. God will raise up an individual to lead them in victory against their oppressors. They'll have a time of, freedom and bliss and providence, but then that entire story will happen again. And it's this cycle that happens over and over and over and over again. Disobedience leads to oppression, and oppression leads to a cry for help, and a cry for help leads to God raising up an individual to save them over and over and over and over and over again. And if you grew up in the church, in Sunday school, or even if you didn't grow up in the church, there's still a good chance you've heard some of these stories, like the story of Samson, this judge who's super strong, has long flowing hair. You might have heard of Gideon, right? And his story, how he kind of asks God for proof that God is actually calling him to do the thing he's calling him to do. Like you said, Mason, earlier, these stories are very, I think, easily rememberable. Oh my goodness, I cannot talk today. They're easily memorable. and we often hear them, like in Sunday school for children, which is odd because they're very dark stories of military conquest. So I don't know. I don't know why they're children's stories. I
think because some of the judges themselves act like children. Honestly, like, I remember as a kid hearing Samson and thinking, oh, he's so cool. He's like Hercules. And then you go get older and you read his story and you're like, this guy's like a middle schooler. Like, someone does something to him, so he's going to retaliate. Well, then they retaliate, and so he retaliates. And it's a story of like a fight on a schoolyard in middle school. And it's so sad when you read his story. All I can think, every time I read Samson's story nowadays, I'm like, you just need the Uncle Ben talk, right? Where you're like, man, you have all this great power, but you need to actually take some responsibility for all the power you have. And he really doesn't. So, but that brings up the point that I wanted to ask you is some of these judges are good and some of them are bad. Wouldn't you say? Like, they're not all in the same category of exactly being good.
Yeah. So the way that Judges operates is it portrays this cycle of disobedience, which leads to oppression, which leads to a cry for help, which leads to God raising up an individual for salvation. But with every single time that cycle occurs, it gets worse and worse and worse and worse. The disobedience.
What do you mean by that?
Well, that's layered. that happens in a lot of different ways. So first off, the disobedience is worse. Israel strays further and further and further from Yahweh, further and further away from his law. They become more evil to the point where they're doing absolutely wicked, vile acts. Like that's really the end of Judges, is this very horrific picture of human evil, and it's being done by the Israelites. And so their disobedience grows, but also that time of prosperity that I said earlier, in between salvation and the cycle beginning again, that time frame actually gets shorter with each cycle. Like if you read Judges, it will tell you how many years passed in between all the stories, and you'll notice that with each story, that time of prosperity gets shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter to where there's cycles happening faster.
Until it's eventually and eventually you get to like Samson and it doesn't even exist. Like he has his heroic moment of killing all of these Philistines, but it never says, and then there was prosperity in the land. It's just, boom. Like, okay, you really didn't save anybody and make things better. You just took a few guys out with you.
Well, and then on top of that, there's another layer of the judges as individual people. They become worse with each narrative. So at the beginning, the judges are individuals who love the Lord. They're trying to faithfully obey God. They're trying to be godly leaders and do the work that he's calling them to do. But with each cycle, they kind of become more selfish, more disobedient, more complicated. You get some judges that are like kind of really morally gray. Like there's a part of them that's trying to seek God, and then there's also a part of them that is disobedient and rejecting God. Till by the end, with Samson never really ever is trying to follow after God. There's like maybe one moment right at the very end of his life where he cries out to God. And even that could be interpreted not even as like a holy cry, but as a selfish cry, depending on how you look at it. So even like the quality of the character of the judges gets worse over time. And so Judges is the cycle of stories. It's the cycle of narratives, but with each narrative, it's increasingly getting worse and increasingly straying further and further and further away from God. And so, Mason, one of the questions I had for you this time is I wanted to ask you, how did this all begin? Like, I know I said earlier, the Israelites failed to do this in Numbers when they sent the spies, and then they failed to do it again at the beginning of Judges. But why? What was the main reason why the Israelites chose to disobey God and not go into the promised land and drive the people out like he had told them to do?
So we're backtracking to Numbers, and you want to know why the people in Numbers?
No, not necessarily Numbers. I was just asking, why do the people fail to drive out the people of the promised land? Like, why are they disobedient? What's the reason, I guess? What's the why there? Because we disobey God for all kinds of different reasons. Why do you think the Israelites disobey God in taking up this task?
That's a good question. I think part of it deals with, okay, they've lost Joshua, and there's no clear leader of the people that's mentioned at the very least. So you have Moses, who leads them out of Egypt and then through the wilderness. And then you have Joshua, who leads them into the promised land. They've had these remarkable leaders who had a remarkable faith and trust in God in spite of some circumstances. And then you have no clear leader who kind of appears after Joshua. Like, there's no okay, here's the mantle it passed down to. Like, everyone was like, we're 12 tribes. Yeah, we make up one nation, but we're all going to go and do our own thing. We've got this. We've been given this mission. Sure, we know how to fulfill the mission. And in chapter 1, you see that they really don't, because it's one person after the next who fails over and over. And so I think we can speculate in a lot of ways of how they failed. You can say, well, they didn't fully trust this God, or they weren't following him. We can talk about just our human nature to naturally be selfish and to be arrogant and to think, well, God helped me back here, but I've got it from here on out. Or viewing God even as a crutch in that aspect. There's a lot that goes into this. If you're looking for a particular verse that says, and this is why they failed, I would need to go back and read Judges chapter 1, to be honest. Because the first thing that comes to my mind, it was in Judges chapter 2 that I read earlier, of where it said, hey, they were pulled away by choosing to worship something other than Yahweh. Like, they broke the, number 1 10 commandments, basically. The 2 was, number 2 was, don't have an idol and no other God but me. And they're like, well, we're going to break both of those at the same time. We're going to go worship this idol of this other God over here, the God of the Canaanites. So rather than worshiping Yahweh, they enter the land of a people group who are worshiping a God named Baal. And they're like, man, we like this Baal. He promises us all the sex, money, and power that we want with no consequences. Let's have him. Let's go after him. And, it's a sad drama, but, and we can look at it and shake our heads. But at the same time, how often do we do the exact same thing? Where, despite our long history with God, we have these moments where something looks a little bit more attractive than the path we've been on. And we end up stepping a little bit off track and find ourselves chasing after the very things that we know, especially as Jesus followers, that we know is only really going to kill and destroy us and prevent us from making the impact and doing the job and the work that we are meant to do. So that's my big theory. If you were looking for something specific or a verse, like I said, I apologize. I need to go back and read Judges chapter 1 here.
Well, I think that I want to take what you just said and build off it. When you were talking about worshiping other gods, Judges doesn't start with Israel worshiping other gods. It starts with their disobedience, but then very quickly builds into their idolatry and the worship of other gods. And so you get this sense right out of the beginning that disobedience is going to lead to further disobedience. Like Israel's failure to trust God and to actually enter the promised land and take it for themselves like he had called them to do, the failure that they had in trusting God that would actually happen, then led them to be led astray into worshiping other gods. So this sin or this disobedience, it breeds further disobedience. And I think that is something that not only sets up all of Judges, because as you read the entirety of Judges, you see how with each cycle it gets worse and worse and worse and worse. But I think it's also very applicable to our own lives today. It's easy, honestly, to even think of it from a purely, physical perspective. Like, you don't even have to be spiritual to understand that your actions have consequences. And your actions create habits and patterns. And so the actions that we make today, the choices that we make today, are really going to not only, have consequences for tomorrow, but they're going to put us in a very particular direction that we're going to walk in tomorrow. And unless we make an active decision to change that direction, the choices that we make today are shaping, the path for our future. And so I think that's something that's very applicable to each and every one of us today, is recognizing that there isn't a single choice we make that's purely in isolation from impacting the rest of our lives. Disobedience breeds further disobedience.
So with that kind of reasoning, would you say then that obedience is, when we oftentimes look at it as a bad thing, it's actually a guardrail and a protector from the consequences of disobedience? When we said the consequences of disobedience is this further chaos and this further evil, and then which leads to, idol worship and that sort of deal. Therefore, would you say that obedience is the guardrail for that? Like, rather than looking at obedience as a negative thing, we should look at obedience as a positive, life-giving thing.
Well, yeah, absolutely. First off, I don't think we should ever view obedience as a negative when it comes to God.
Oh yeah, I don't. It has a natural, like, people always groan when they're like, oh, like, obedience, be obedient to this God, which of course says something to our sinful nature.
Well, yeah, well, it's partially our sinful nature. I think it's also partially like our very specific cultural context. Mason, you and I live in a culture that from birth is taught to be distrustful of authority and rebellion. I mean, if you live in the United States, our entire nation's origin story is born in rebellion. Rebellion against other countries and fighting against them and fighting for your own way, which is the exact thing that the Israelites do against God, and it does not go well for them over and over and over again. But yeah, I think another way to think about this too is to take a step back and look at the Bible as a whole. If you were to scan through every page of the Bible, you'd find that over and over and over and over again, the biblical authors will use this language of like a way or a path, that God is putting us on a certain path or a path to life. And we need to view our lives as walking down a path. You can be walking down a sinful path, an evil path, or you can be walking down a path that produces life and goodness. I can think of Psalm 25, how in Psalm 25, the psalmist is singing about or praying about, how God is a teacher and he's an instructor and he shows people, he even shows sinners the path of righteousness. And so I think how we view the choices that we make, we need to view each choice as pointing us in a particular direction or pointing us down a certain path. And the more choices we make that are pointed in a particular direction, the easier it is going to be to keep going down that direction. But when we're headed, the complete opposite direction, it can be really hard to turn around.
You're right. But wait, what's really comforting then? Sorry, I had a little hiccup right there, I guess. What's really comforting about the story of Judges is the fact that when his people got to this point, God responded by bringing up leaders whose job was to call them back. And yes, they get worse and worse. And that probably says something to the fact that God is using just the best resources on hand to fix a problem. But what encouragement do you think that offers to us? Because I look into that and I'm like, okay, that means when I stray, that God is not just going to sit back and be like, fine with it, but he's going to raise a leader up to call me back. Now, as a Jesus follower, I recognize that the greatest leader that's been called to call me back is certainly Jesus. But I recognize as well in my own life that there have been times where God has used other individuals for this purpose as well, to challenge me or to confront me, to say, hey, Mason, that was wrong what you just did over there. So this might speak into another aspect that we want to look at is, okay, what was the story of the judges themselves, not the people, but the judges themselves? What does that then offer to us in a 21st century world?
Well, I think the key here, honestly, is right at the beginning of chapter 2. Like chapters 1 and 2 really paint the whole picture of what all of Judges is going to be about. And in the beginning of chapter 2, God says, I brought you up from Egypt, and I brought you into the land that I swore to give to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. There's this promise right at the beginning. God says, I will never break my covenant with you. God always depicts himself as a faithful God. He's faithful to his people. And he continues and he asks, why have you not obeyed me? Why did you not remain faithful to me? But what you see over and over and over again is that even though Israel isn't faithful, God keeps his promise, and he is faithful over and over and over again. So I think even though Judges can be very depressing and dark and at times horrifying to see how people stray further and further and further away from God, it is also encouraging to hear this promise and to see it in action, that God is faithful, that God is merciful, that even when people reject him, God still has mercy, and God is still at work. God is still redeeming people and drawing them back to himself. And so I think, since this whole project is centered around this idea of work and our purpose and our mission and the work that God gives us to do, I think we need to remember the exact same thing. There are times in every single person's life, in every follower of Christ's life, where we know God's calling us in a particular direction, or calling us to do a certain thing, and we just fail. We don't take that work on. We reject it. Like Jonah, we run the complete opposite direction. And that has consequences. It has consequences on us, as individuals. It can impact our future work and make that future work more difficult or more painful. But the truth is that God is still faithful to us. And even if we're disobedient to God today, God is still going to remain faithful. And he's going to redeem us, and he's going to draw us back to him, and he's going to redeem the work that he's given us. And he's going to turn us into people that will do that work faithfully. I think that maybe is the comfort there in knowing that despite our disobedience and our rejection of the mission God's giving us, God does not change. He remains faithful. And we can always go back to him, and we can always lean on him, and he's happy to receive us.
So would you then say that, in some degree then, if we're talking about this being a faithful God who is faithful to a faithless people, and he's not all right with letting his faithless people just wander away, like he's going to continue to call him back, that in some ways that God still uses judges in a modern day setting, Probably not in the same setting where it's like, okay,
not-
grab your sword and shield, here we go.
Maybe not in the military setting, because we have to, be careful to remember that was a very, very specific context that the military conquest, came up in.
I'm glad you brought that up, because a lot of people uses judges, for justification for all sorts of evil towards others, and that is a very specific case and study to a very specific people at a very specific time in history. So God is not calling you to do violence towards another human being. No. And please don't use Judges and Joshua as justification for that.
I think going back to
go on.
I think the important thing to remember, and this is a good way to approach the Bible as a whole, is that what is the gospel of Jesus centered on? I think for a lot of people, our immediate thought is thinking of like heaven or hell. But if you actually read through the Gospels, the good news of Jesus that he's talking about, it's not centered on heaven or hell. It's centered on this concept called the kingdom of God. Mm-hmm. Right now, actually, with our high school students, we're going through the series. We're just reading through all of Mark and seeing how it's centered on this idea that Jesus is calling people to join his kingdom and that he is the king of that kingdom. And so I think for us today, we need to recognize that as followers of Jesus, we're a part of the kingdom of God. And that's a real kingdom. It's a real people. But the kingdom of God is not an earthly kingdom. It's not a nation like the United States of America or, I don't know, France or Germany or South Africa or I don't know how many countries we're going to list, right? The kingdom of God is not like earthly kingdoms. It's a real kingdom. It's a real people group. It has a king, and that's Jesus. But it is very different. And we need to recognize that when we become a follower of Christ, we're a part of this new kingdom. We're a part of this new people. Paul talks about this. I can't remember in what epistle, but he talks about how we've become citizens of heaven, right?
Philippians.
It's Philippians. There we go.
Yeah, only because that's going to be my Easter message, and I was working on it right before we jumped on this.
Yeah, but
so go ahead, talk. Give me all the content I need for my message.
Well, we are citizens of this new kingdom, and that drastically changes how we see the rest of the world. We don't need to be afraid that another country or another human being is our enemy. Because Paul's also going to go on to write that we're not at war with flesh and blood, but with the spiritual powers and the princes of the air, right? Our enemy is a spiritual enemy. And that's something that I think we need to be very aware of and in that sense, fighting against. Like we are at a war with a spiritual war against spiritual forces. Our enemies aren't other human beings. It's our mission to show other human beings, even though they might be sinful or might not treat us well, it's our job to show them the person of Christ and hopefully give them the good news that they can join the kingdom of God as well. And so I think in that sense, God does raise up people to lead his people in this fight against spiritual forces of evil. But it's not a military one by any means. And regardless of, who God calls to be a leader, there isn't like a hierarchy in terms of human beings within the church. We all stand as equals before Christ, who's our true king. And so even though God is going to call different people to different places and do different jobs, he's going to call some people to be leaders. Like think about the church context, for instance. Every congregation has leaders, pastors and elders who are actively leading that church community, right? But none of those pastors or elders are the king of that kingdom and that people. Jesus is the king. And so
depends on what church you go to.
Well, we're assuming a good, biblical church here. Yeah. But yeah, I think that's something that we need to kind of, I guess, be aware of or balance, is that God is calling people all across the world to different tasks, to different jobs. And it's okay that they're different. It's okay that some people are going to be leading groups and other people aren't going to be, necessarily leaders of a group of people or whatnot. That's okay. But we all need to recognize that God is calling us to a life of obedience, and that he's going to give us work and he's going to give us missions that we should be very careful to actually seek to fulfill out. I mean, the verse that really serves as the foundation of this whole project is Paul in one of his letters writing to Archippus. Be sure to carry out the ministry that God has called you to, that God has given you. Paul says, be sure to do it. And it makes me think of like Judges, where God had given the people of Israel a mission and they did not carry it out. And I wonder if Paul is thinking about this when he's talking to Archippus and he's warning him. He's saying, be sure to do it. And I think that leads us to also talk about too, if God gives you a mission, he's not going to set you up to fail. I think we get really caught up in this idea that, what if I'm not good enough? What if I'm not skilled enough? What if I make mistakes or any of that? But there's never a moment in the Bible where God says, hey, you have to be this skilled or this excellent, or you have to have this much talent in order to do the job I'm calling you to do. If God's given you a mission, or if he's given you work to do, he's also going to provide the means of getting it done. Like, he's going to give you the skill. He's going to give you the talent. He's going to give you the training or the wisdom. He's going to give you other people to help guide you to actually see that it happens. The number one thing that God asks of us when he gives us work, or he gives us a mission, is that we're obedient to him. In fact, there's a whole story in Judges. It's the story of Gideon, where God raises up Gideon as a leader, as a judge, and he's getting like an army built together to fight against their oppressors. And God says, hey, there's way too many people in this army. If I were to give you victory over your oppressors, you might think that it was because of your own strength. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to actually reduce the number of people in your army. And so they get rid of a bunch of people. And then God says, hey, this army's still way too big. And they reduce it again to the point where the army that Gideon is leading it's not even an army, right? It is a very small group of people fighting against, a big army and their oppressors. But they're victorious. And God does that as a way to show Israel, like, your success is from me. I'm giving you the power. I'm giving you the victory. What I'm asking you is to simply be obedient. That's what God wants. God is not looking for skill. God is not looking for talent, right? This is a God of the universe who created the cosmos, right? Just simply by speaking it into being, right? God is not looking for skill or talent. God is looking for obedience. He's looking for faithfulness. And so when we think about our life and like, what should I be doing? Or how can I be a good worker? How can I be a good servant? I think the first thing we got to just realize is we have to be obedient. We have to be obedient to God and seek him and be faithful. And then God is going to do the work to put everything else in place. He's going to give us skill. He's going to give us talent. He's going to give us education. He's going to give us guidance to actually complete the work that he's calling us to do.
That's good. You hit on a lot of really good stuff there. I'm trying to decide what do I want to dive into right there.
I felt like I was talking for a long time.
Now, you gave, I think, a lot of good wisdom there. Of here's this God who he calls us, he equips us, he challenges us, and he kind of did that with the judges. You look at Gideon, and who constantly was doubting God, who constantly said, God, there's no way. And then God put him in a situation to like almost further doubt, saying, okay, you've got this big success, you've got this big army behind you, but we're going to break it down. And then I'm going to take away your weapons and I'm going to give you some jars and you're just going to smash the jars. And then that's going to cause chaos. And it's going to be very clear who the victory is, which I think should say something to us as leaders that God doesn't really need us. But he's willing to use our brokenness and our weakness to reveal his strength. Paul kind of talks about that. But Gideon ends up failing later on. Like, rather than being obedient and rather than keeping his focus primarily on serving for the glory of God and for the betterment of others, he starts to turn selfish and turn inwards. Like, he forgets, hey, I'm in this role as a leader to be a blessing towards others, and he starts to acquire more blessings for himself. And rather than, hey, I'm supposed to be devoted to this God and be obedient to him, he kind of makes idols with the blessings that other people brought to him. And he ends in this massive failure where what started out as good and what had some amazing moments did not last. It did not end good because this disobedience crept in, which, again, we've talked about obedience is supposed to be like a guardrail to prevent chaos. And because he was disobedient, I know the text says it led other people to worshiping his idols, and it led other people astray, which also goes to show that none of our actions are really just about us. There's always a community aspect to everything, both to our obedience and to our disobedience, so that when we are disobedient, not only does it lead to greater likelihood of disobedience in the future and greater problems in the future, but it could also do that for others as well. Like, it could prevent others from being in a position that they need to be, or it could put someone else in a position where they're harmed and they're limited because you as a leader were not obedient, which, I'll be honest, is really challenging. I think, especially for us, you and me, who are church leaders, who are pastors, who are leading our own little flocks, so to speak, that God has entrusted to us. And if we're not obedient, then our people suffer, our wives suffer, our children suffer, because of our lack of obedience. We are, as creatures, we are naturally connected. We are community-based. Even someone who wants to be alone and wants to live off on an island by themselves, we are wired to crave community, and we are wired in a world where all of our actions have consequences, sometimes faced by those around us. But there's also beauty in that, such as when we're struggling personally with issues or with mental health or with addictions, that the healing here is not in solitude and isolation. It's in community. It's in partnership. It's in brotherhood. But that requires, again, obedience. And so here's where the challenge, I guess, for anyone who is called into something that God has called them to do, to see, hey, man, if I'm obedient to what God has called me to do, even if it's difficult, even if it's something I don't want to do, which is oftentimes the case, there's a blessing in it where if you follow in obedience, it's going to save you some trouble later on down the road that you don't have to go down if you are obedient. And if you're obedient, it could bring about a blessing for someone else. But disobedience to what God is calling you to do and what God has asked you to do could do the exact same, but in a negative aspect, where it leads to disaster for you later on down the road, and it leads to disaster for someone else, and it leads to an easier aspect of greater disobedience further down the road. Because all this, you made a comment earlier, like they didn't start out with some of the horrific stuff that's found in the end of Judges. Like the end of Judges, like the enemy that they're fighting is not a foreign enemy, it's themselves. Like civil war breaks out, they nearly eliminate an entire tribe, it's mass genocide, it's just absolute chaos, because this disobedience that they've been doing has turned darker and darker, and it's turned people who should have been brothers, it's finally turned them against each other and to destroying, almost ending this storyline of this people because they weren't doing what God had called them to do. And so that's really encouraging, that we should stop looking, as Americans especially, as obedience as a negative thing or as a hindrance, but we should see it as, man, if God is asking us to do something, or if he's calling us to step into this over here, it's because he's got a great joy for us, and it might relieve some sort of oppression in someone else's life.
Yeah, well, I love how you brought up, this whole communal aspect, because I think that's something within our cultural context we easily miss because we're raised in this very individualistic culture. The Bible does not portray that. We're not just purely individualistic creatures. Our choices don't just impact us, they impact the people around us. That's all throughout the Bible. And you see it in Judges, where God raises up individuals to lead, and their faithfulness can end up bringing salvation for a whole generation of Israelites. But their failures can also doom a whole generation of Israelites. And so we really need to think about how when we are obedient to God, we actually can be a blessing to the people around us, even to people that we may not even realize. But when we're disobedient, that doesn't just impact us, it also negatively impacts the people around us. And Paul writes about this great in the New Testament. He says that through one man, Adam, all have found death, but through the righteousness of another man, and Jesus, we're given life. We really need to think about how our mission isn't just our mission. It's not just about us. Our work isn't just about us. The choices that we make, they really do impact and reach out to all the people around us. There are these ripples all through life with each choice we make. And so we need to view our relationship with God and our obedience to God as not just between us and God, but between us and the rest of the world. And, that was the main reason God formed the people of Israel in the first place, that through them, they would be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. And so it is hopefully through us, as citizens of the kingdom of God, that we would be faithful and obedient citizens, that God can bless the world through us, and that we can point people to the ultimate King in whom we can all find life.
That brings up two things I want to ask you, and I'll throw both of them out right now because you might be able to bring them into the same answer, or you might have your favorite here that you want to tackle. Okay, so the first aspect then is, if we are walking in obedience, but we're still living in a Judges type world, where we're still experiencing the scorn and the effects of the disobedience of others around us. And it's still kind of chaotic, but we're still trying to be obedient the best we can. And we're waiting on this faithful God to do his work. What do we do in the process? Or what can we look to in that space? Where do we go about following this God in this space as we wait on him? And then the second question is, Judges ends with this final statement, and I think these kind of blend into each other, similar questions, but this final statement in Judges is found in chapter 21, and it says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." So can you speak on that of, why would the book end with this kind of statement? What does that mean for us right now as we're, trying to follow this God, and we're trying to step into the work that God has called us to? And even for us, for you and me and Archippus, as we're wanting to encourage others, to follow the work that God has called them to do. How do we do that when we might still very well live in a judges type world where we're trying to be obedient and we're trying to wait on this faithful God, but we're watching as people are still doing what they see is right in their own eyes, and they don't see the destruction that's causing. So those are two kind of different questions, but as I'm saying, it starts to bleed into one, I'm saying. So unless you want to treat them as two separate questions, but I want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the key to life is to see God at the center of life instead of us. So when we're talking about work or a mission or a purpose, that's not a mission we've given ourselves. It's not a purpose we've given ourselves. If it's true, good, and godly, then we have to recognize that God is the center. God is the origin of our work. When we're thinking about our morality and how we live our life and how we make sure that we're living a good life, we need to make sure that it's not, just what I think is good and right, but that God is at the center of it and that we're living a moral, good life according to the law that God gives.
How can we be sure of that?
How can you be sure of that?
Yeah, for our readers, how can you be sure of that? Not readers, listeners.
Well, I think it goes back to... yeah. I think it goes back to that reference I made earlier in Psalm 25, how it depicts God as a teacher, as an instructor, how he shows sinners the path of righteousness. God doesn't expect us to have everything all figured out all at once. The life of following Jesus is a life that develops and grows and is built over time. And so we need to just lean on God and trust him. We need to see God as the center of life and that he's going to continue to build up and build up and build up and do a good work in us. He's going to shape us. He's going to form us. He's going to teach us. The key is for us to come to him in humility day after day after day after day. I think that's one of the important aspects of the spiritual disciplines, of coming to God's word regularly, coming to God in prayer regularly, gathering with fellow believers in worship regularly. These practices, it's not that there's an innate value in the practice in and of itself. It's that when we do those things, we're humbly coming before the God of the universe and worshiping him, depending on him, in communication with him. So I think that's the answer to your two questions. We do live in a chaotic world. We live in a world where it's changing very quickly and it's very confusing, and it feels like everybody is just doing whatever they think is good and right. And the way that we can live good and peaceful lives in the midst of this chaotic world is to just put God right at the center of it, to see him as the source of everything good, and to lean on him and trust him and filter everything through him. I mean, it really just comes down to coming before God, I think, in humility with every situation we enter into, coming to God in prayer about it. When it comes to questions about life, asking God those questions. And I think that's not something that you just do once. It's not something you just figure out one day of your life, but that is something that you do for your whole life, regularly and routinely, as you walk down the path of righteousness. And I think that's also why Judges portrays its cycle as this repeating cycle. It's not just one story, but you get story after story after story after story. Your life is more than one decision. Your life is more than one choice. Your life is more than one act of obedience or one act of disobedience. Your life is a whole life of choices and decisions. And we need, through each and every single day, to continually come back to God in humility and see him as the source of everything that's good. That's a daily practice. That's not something you just do one time. Thank you for listening to the Archippus Podcast.
If you enjoyed this podcast, we would appreciate it so much if you would share what you thought of it. Leave a review, leave a like, a 5-star rating. That so much helps us to promote this podcast, to share the word, and be an encouragement to others.
And if you want to support the project in other ways, you can check out our website, archippushouse.com. There we have several different resources that you can check out. And we even made some merch. We made some t-shirts and hats with our logo. Getting any of that helps financially support the project, and it's just a fun extra way to help share and invite others to check out the project.
And if you go to archippushouse.com, there you can also sign up for our mailing list. And if you join our mailing list, we promise to send you multiple free copies of our books. So if you like free books and you like our books, join our mailing list and we will send you our books for free just for being a fan.
Thanks again for engaging with and supporting the project. And we hope to see you next time.